just so you all know. And welcome to this morning's little webinar training on CSP enhancements in Utah. We've got several practices that I hope we have time to get through today. We're going to start with brush management and herbaceous weed control. Now, here's a list of the 5 practices or 5 enhancements that are tied to brush management and herbaceous weed control. There's only 2 that are tied to brush management and 3 that are tied to herbaceous weed control. They group together fairly well. The 2 that are tied to brush management replace an old enhancement in old CSP WQL.28, which was biological suppression and other non-chemical techniques to manage brush, weeds, and invasive species. If I remember right, I don't think this new enhancement is quite as restrictive as to say it's not chemical. I think you can use chemicals in these new enhancements, but they're differentiated by what resource concern you're trying to address. One is brush management for improved structure and composition, and the other one is brush management that maintains or enhances fish and wildlife habitat. Both of them are only applicable on rangelands, and both of them pay $14.84 per acre. The enhancement description of both of these brush management enhancements is brush management that's employed to create the desired plant community consistent with the related ecological site steady state, which will maintain or enhance wildlife habitat. And one interesting note is that these enhancements do not apply to removal of woody vegetation by prescribed fire or removal of woody vegetation to facilitate a land use change. The criteria for these 2 enhancements are that you have to identify the species of concern, not just the target brush species, but the wildlife species of concern. And the enhancement will be applied in a manner to achieve the desired control of the target woody species while protecting the desired species through mechanical, chemical, or biological means, alone or in combination. So there's really no constraint on the techniques that we're going to use for brush management here. And they want to emphasize that NRCS will not develop biological or chemical recommendations except biological control using grazing animals. That's okay. And of course, you know what we do instead of developing those recommendations is that we pass on recommendations for biological or chemical treatments through reference to or from Extension Service or some other like agency. These enhancements need to have a WEG that will result in a 0.75 or greater score following the treatment. And the rest of these criteria are pretty basic for brush management, just as doing the practice. You have to do these during periods of the year that accommodate reproduction and life cycle requirements of the targeted wildlife and pollinator species. So, for example, not during the nesting season. It's pretty open-ended on these brush management enhancements. I notice they don't pay a whole bunch, but if you can document this wildlife habitat benefit to doing the brush management, primarily through the WEG score increasing at above 0.75, these enhancements could be used. You have to clearly identify the species of concern in your documentation. These are the documentation requirements. You'll be using the brush management spec sheet with all the basic stuff that you do there, and you have to show us the WEG in the documentation. So yeah, like I said, in Utah, any brush management practice that is done for wildlife habitat purposes, for sage grouse, for mule deer, so anything that kills a juniper tree could probably fit in this enhancement. Okay, before we leave brush management enhancements, any questions on those?
So I assume you use the WAG related to the species specifically?
Yeah, I think typically you'd have a species of concern that you'd choose. That you're targeting.
Shane, I had a question. Looking at this, based on what this is saying, then is there any brush management that's done as an enhancement? It's being done with, I guess, a focus on wildlife.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because both of these enhancements, the enhancement description mentions the wildlife purpose as being a definition of these enhancements, and the criteria and documentation required the 0.75 after score. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering if are there cases where there's brush management done as an enhancement where it's not meant to benefit wildlife?
Not in this program.
Okay. Okay, that clarifies it. Thank you.
Not in CSP. There's no brush management enhancements in CSP that aren't targeted to wildlife. Okay, let's move on to the 315 herbaceous weed control enhancements. There's an old enhancement WQL.28, which was biological suppression and other non-chemical techniques to manage brush, weeds, and invasive species, and now that's covered by, well, I think that's the same one, the two enhancements we just discussed, and these three, which are attached to herbaceous weed control, 315. These three enhancements are also having to do with habitat and a lot of emphasis on the ecological site. They are differing in the land uses that they're applicable for. You can see the first one is for pasture and rangeland. The second one is for range and forest land. The last one is pasture, range, or associated ag land. And the resource concern that they're targeted towards is different. The first one is targeted towards plant productivity and health. The second one is inadequate structure and composition, and the last one is excessive plant pest pressure, which is the one you'd think that this practice is pretty much always targeted towards. All three of these pay $12.39 an acre. The enhancement description on all three of these is mechanical, chemical, or biological. Herbaceous weed control will be employed on targeted herbaceous weeds so as to create, release, or restore desired plant communities that are consistent with achievable ecological site steady-state descriptions. So again, with the emphasis on the biological and chemical recommendations that NRCS does not create. The emphasis here on the site description, though, is important. They want us to use the state and transition models, and they want us to choose one of the plant communities, one of the boxes on the state and transition model, and say that is our target. That's what we're trying to create here with this enhancement. And so the treatments must be congruent with the dynamics of the ESDs and keyed to state and plant community phases that have potential for supporting the desired plant community. Also in the criteria, it says herbaceous weed control will include post-treatment measures as needed to achieve the recorded resource management objectives. So if you, for example, if you're trying to do this in cheatgrass and you use some chemical to eliminate cheatgrass, you have to put in whatever post-treatment measure like seeding that you would need to finish achieving the objective. And the treatment periods will accommodate wildlife. It'll promote restoration of the desired plant communities. When herbicides are used, follow the label. Access to treated or target area will be controlled. As far as restrictions on the chemical labels, when they can be grazed again. On the documentation requirements, they want the site description or the reference sheet specifying the desired plant community that you're targeting, and a job sheet that is complete with the target plant species, the desired level of control, essentially the herbaceous weed control spec sheet that we have already. So as near as I can tell, as long as it fits in with the applicable land uses and the applicable resource concerns that are being targeted, almost any herbaceous weed control project could fit into these enhancements, the way I see it. Any questions on these so far? So again, like every other enhancement that we've discussed, the Utah amendments to these enhancements will simply say that in the criteria we want you to use the spec sheets for brush management and herbaceous weed control to plan and apply and certify these enhancements. And in the documentation requirements, we want you to look at the state standards for these practices and document, besides what's listed here in the enhancement itself, any certification requirements that are listed in the state standard. Okay. If there's no questions, I'll just move right along to the next set. Okay, in this little set, we've got 3 practices we'll cover. Fence, access control, and for old timers like me, it's the practice we used to call use exclusion, and a weird little practice called stream crossing. So there's only 4 enhancements attached to these 3 practices. 1 for fence, 2 for access control, and 1 for stream crossings. So in the old CSP, there were a couple of enhancements that were tied to fencing. A&M 60 and A&M 27, grouse friendly or wildlife friendly fencing. They're both replaced now with this new enhancement for fencing called incorporating wildlife friendly fencing for connectivity of wildlife food resources. This enhancement is applicable on pasture and rangeland. It's targeting fish and wildlife inadequate habitat for food. It pays 15 cents a linear foot and has a lifespan of 20 years. Renee, did you want to take over at this point?
Sure. So the enhancement description for this is retrofitting or constructing fences that provide some way to control the movement of animals, people, vehicles, with a focus on minimizing impacts to wildlife movements. For the criteria, the type and design of fence retrofitting or construction needs to meet management objectives and site challenges. So in the fence job sheet, you need to specify the animal species of concern, both wildlife and domestic, wildlife movement, specific modifications to be made to existing fences to meet those management objectives. Wildlife movement specific specifications will be incorporated into the newly constructed fences, location of wildlife friendly fences, and the location of habitat types affected by the fence. For example, when thinking about like pronghorn antelope, you would take into consideration having a smooth wire at the bottom of the fence, at 14 inches height above ground. Deer would need something else where you might have a maximum height of 42 inches with a minimum of 12 inches between the top 2 wires, and then so on for all the different species. So at the bottom for sage grouse or lesser prairie chickens, well, for us sage grouse, you would put markers on the fences, especially if they were brand new fences or fit into the high fence collision risk model that we have, showing where you'd want to mark fences. Okay, additional criteria would be taking into consideration height, size, spacing, and type of materials used to provide the desired control, life expectancy, and management of people and animal of concern. New fences will be designed and located and installed to meet appropriate local wildlife and land management needs and requirements. Avoid clearing of right-of-way vegetation during the nesting season for migratory birds. Plans and specifications are to be prepared for all fence types, installations, and specific sites. The documentation requirements for wildlife-friendly fence are documentation of the animal. So again, it's the wildlife and domestic species of concern that are targeted for the fence, either retrofitting or construction. The local state's NRCS approved job sheet needs to be completed by NRCS and will be followed by retrofitting or construction. The job sheet needs to clearly state the animal species of concern, the wildlife movement specific modifications to be made to those fences, and how those are meeting management objectives, the wildlife movement specific specifications that will be incorporated into newly constructed fences, and the location.
Okay. Thanks, Renee. That brings us to the next set of enhancements. Interestingly, I think that's the only enhancement, that fence one, that I've looked at so far that's targeted towards wildlife that doesn't require a WEG in the criteria or the documentation requirements. There's no minimum WEG score. It's just make your fences wildlife friendly. Any questions?
That is interesting.
Yeah. Any questions on the fence enhancement?
Dane, I have a question. So if we're retrofitting existing fences based on the species that we're targeting, that new retrofitted fence, if it needs, like wire spacing or something like that, needs to change, does it have to meet our current construction specs and new material and all that kind of stuff for the new fence, for the retrofitted fence?
Wow. Damn good question. I would say that oh crap, I don't know. Totally caught me off guard. On one hand, the whole basis for having these enhancements that are tied to practices is they have to meet the practice standard first before they can get an enhancement. And then you've got this fence enhancement that's talking about retrofitting existing fences. Anytime you retrofit an existing fence, everything out there on that fence is used material.
I've joined the conference.
Right? So how does that work?
I'll say the last little bit one more time. I didn't catch it.
Well, I'm just thinking out loud through this now in the middle of a webinar. So yeah, I'll probably regret this later. Anytime you enhance, or anytime you retrofit an existing fence, everything in that existing fence is used material. And so how can it meet the fence standard? Yep. I guess I don't know, this could get weird. Fences also have a lifespan.
Yep.
So maybe you can only retrofit fences that were within their lifespan, or I don't think we want to say that. I hope it's not that much constraint on this, but anytime they've retrofitted a fence, like putting fence markers on, they've used a different practice. They've used that wildlife practice, structures for wildlife,
yeah,
instead of fence,
yeah,
to do it. But here they're wanting this, in this fence enhancement, to retrofit a fence using the fence practice and this enhancement. I don't know. I think that's a chink in the armor. I think somebody didn't think of that.
Well, I asked you because I actually used this in a CSP last year, and luckily he needed to build some new fence. But the wildlife guidance, there wasn't very much when I planned the CSP, and luckily, he was pretty knowledgeable about what he needed anyways. But maybe if somebody chooses this, like we could probably work with you separately on some real wildlife guidance depending on the species that we're working on.
Right.
That would meet kind of a general construction criteria.
Well, let me take that little issue because it's I guess you could say it's likely to come up. You've already kind of skirted around the edges of it in your own work, it sounds like. So let me push that question upstairs and get some answers, okay?
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, with that, 472 access control practice. So there are no old enhancements that these are replacing. These enhancements are brand new. They are to manage livestock access to streams, ditches, and other water bodies to reduce either nutrients or pathogens in the surface water. Both of these are targeted to water quality. Both of them are applicable on every land use. I can see the list of land uses there, and I don't think there are any missing. So this is applicable anywhere. They pay $2.16 per foot with a lifespan of 10 years. The enhancement description is to install structures and implement grazing management actions that restrict livestock access to streams, ditches, and other water bodies in order to reduce nutrient loading or pathogens to surface waters. The criteria are to manage livestock access, to provide benefits to surface water quality, get better manure distribution, and reduce nutrient input into surface waters, to use regulating activities like gates, fences, and other barriers shall be implemented to eliminate livestock access to streams, to reduce nutrients in surface waters. So they're looking for exclusion mainly. However, they are allowing for limited stream access at hardened stream crossings or other water access points. Preferably, you'd install alternative water sources away from the water courses or water bodies, but it is allowable to have water access points. They want to implement riparian area grazing management strategies. The livestock activity will be monitored and regulated very specifically. These activities may involve temporary to permanent livestock exclusion. The placement, dimensions, materials of gates, and frequency of use shall be described for each activity, including monitoring frequency. For documentation requirements, you need a written grazing management plan. For riparian grazing management strategies, you need a written narrative describing the planned season of use. You need a map showing locations of installed structures. And, you know, I'm thinking by structures, they're talking a fence here. It's not constrained to a fence, but basically this enhancement wants you to fence the surface water off from livestock access. You can see that's where they're going with this. So any questions about these enhancements?
So how wildlife friendly does that fence have to be, Shane?
It doesn't have to be wildlife friendly, but it sure would be nice if you did. Because what if you combined this enhancement and the fence enhancement? You could get an extra 15 cents a foot for making it wildlife friendly. Yeah, this fence is built for the purpose of water quality. So, all right, moving on. 578 stream crossing. I had to go read the standard on this practice. I wasn't real familiar with it, and the way they've used it here is weird. But there's no old enhancement. The enhancement is stream crossing elimination, but the practice is building stream crossings, and it's applicable on any land use, and it's worth $7,000 each. So you can kind of get an idea of what they're envisioning here. Part of the idea of this enhancement, the enhancement description, is that existing stream crossings on an operation are consolidated into fewer crossings in order to reduce impacts to stream habitat. And according to the practice standard here, side note, stream crossings include bridges, culverts, and fords. So anywhere there's a road that crosses a stream, whether they're just driving through it, going through a culvert, or over a bridge, those all count as stream crossings. And if you can take an operation that has multiples of these and consolidate them down into fewer crossings, that is what the intent of this enhancement is. Criteria to minimize the number of stream crossings through evaluation of alternative trail or travelway locations. We're talking about maybe we have to move a road, maybe we have to close a road, maybe we have to remove a culvert and restore the stream, maybe we have to remove a bridge and restore the stream, maybe we have to build a new bridge, I don't know. So they want to consolidate and minimize, and the reason that they're doing it is to minimize habitat fragmentation and minimize barriers to aquatic organism movement. It's being done for fish. So you need to evaluate. Go ahead.
Would you dare say we can go as far as to say an ATV trail that crosses the North Fork of the Virgin River?
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a bona fide road. It's just stream crossings. I think it could be a cattle trail where there's a stock trail or something. Yeah. So yeah, you got your wheels turning, I can see. That's good. Maybe this will work out. You need to evaluate the proposed crossing removal sites for variations in stage and discharge, tidal influence, hydraulics, all these things. A lot of engineering things. And I should mention that this 578 practice is an engineering practice. So if you're planning on using this, it's going to necessitate design work, etc., and the assistance of our engineers. You want to assess the effects of the removals upon the channel with respect to local site conditions and stream geomorphology to the extent possible. They're really wanting you to look at the effects of both the removals that you're proposing and the consolidate and the putting in anything new or consolidating that you're proposing. And they keep emphasizing this. Assess the impacts. Road crossings can affect wetlands, flooding potential, existing infrastructure, social and cultural practices and resources. Evaluate and address the full range of impacts when designing removal projects. Replacing or removing an existing in-stream structure may trigger channel adjustments upstream or downstream, mitigate undesirable channel planner profile shifts resulting from the removal of a crossing. If you have to do bank protection when you take out a crossing or a culvert or something like that, then you have to do it. You can see why this is $7,000 each now, I think. You want to return the stream to a condition to provide passage for as many different aquatic species and age classes as possible. That's the ultimate goal. You want to incorporate natural stream bed substrates throughout the removed crossing length. Retain as much vegetation as possible, and if there's places that need to be planted, you're going to plant riparian vegetation after the crossing structure removal. Where appropriate, consider removing the associated access roads or trails and restoring native vegetation. As far as documentation requirements, specs for this practice shall be prepared for each site. Specs shall be recorded using approved spec sheets, job sheets, narrative statements in the plan, or other acceptable documentation. And here it's going to be designs and construction specs with the assistance of the engineers. Any more questions on this stream crossing elimination enhancement? Okay, again, our blanket state addendum to all enhancements are that we want to use the spec sheets and the certification requirements in the state specs. With that, we've been going for about 40 minutes, and if you'll hang with me for an hour, I think I can get a couple more of these enhancements under our belt. Yes, let's talk about fire. So we've got some enhancements with prescribed burning and the fuel break practice that are available. So here's a list of, I forgot to change the title here. This is the prescribed burning and fuel break practice list. It looks like, well, there's just 5 prescribed burning ones here. Man, you can tell I was in a hurry when I did this. So I hope that improves. Here's the one enhancement. There's only one enhancement with fuel break, practice 383. The old enhancement that it replaces was prescribed burning for upland birds and other wildlife. I don't know how creating a fuel break replaces a prescribed burning enhancement, but that's what the chart said. The new enhancement is grazing-maintained fuel breaks to reduce the risk of fire. This is applicable on forest or rangeland. It's targeted towards the resource concern that you think that a fuel break would be: excessive biomass accumulation and wildfire hazard. It pays $251 an acre. And interestingly, it has a 10-year lifespan, even though it's grazing to maintain it annually. I can't explain why that is, but that's what it is. One trick here, you have to have an existing fuel break. The area has existing fuel breaks of 30 to 60 feet in width that support a mixture of woody sprouts and some herbaceous vegetation. And then furthermore, you have to warm season perennial veg will be established on the fuel breaks and will be overseeded with cool season annual forages in the fall. I don't know, this might just eliminate Utah from being able to use this at all. It's more than just grazing to manage the fuel breaks, because we're talking about, well, first of all, having an existing fuel break in that you're going to enhance, and then secondly, establishing warm season perennial vegetation, which there aren't a lot of examples of warm seasons that are going to work out for us in a wildland seeding in Utah. And overseeding with, anyway, just in the description, I think there's some constraints here that's going to keep us from being able to use this practice very effectively. With that, who wants me to continue with this practice? Does anybody see any hope of using this or have any interest in more details on this enhancement? And I am going to breeze through that like that. And I'll start in on the prescribed burning enhancements. There were 5 total, and I've grouped up these 2 here that were similar. They're both applicable on rangeland. They both pay $7.29 an acre annually, or every year that you do the burn, but they're replacing an old enhancement called prescribed burning for upland birds and other wildlife. The new enhancements are called strategically planned patch burning for grazing distribution and wildlife habitat, whether you're addressing excessive plant pest pressure or wildfire hazard. The enhancement description on both of these is patch burn grazing is application of prescribed fires on portions of a grazing unit at different times of the year. Patch burn grazing allows grazing animals to select where they want to graze, creating a mosaic of vegetation structure and diversity that will maintain or enhance the wildlife habitat desired for the identified wildlife species and maintain livestock production. So this is a practice that's been popularized in the Great Plains a lot. I suppose we could find some environments in Utah where this could work out, but in general, you take a big pasture and, well, let me just dive into the examples that they talk about here. Criteria. Each burn event will cover 10 to 50% of a pasture's acreage. So you're going to have a burned and an unburned part in that pasture. So what that's doing is creating edge and different vegetation composition, different vegetation structure, and basically variety of environment in that pasture. It's going to affect grazing distribution and livestock use, and supposedly this variety enhances wildlife habitat. Subsequent individual burn events occur during different seasons. So we might do a spring burn and then do a fall burn. So for example, pasture A is burned in March, and then you burn another part of pasture A in August of the same year. Okay? Or pasture A is burned in March, pasture B is burned in August 2 years later. Or pasture A is burned in March and pasture C is burned in August of the same year. All of these are allowable, but they all contain this principle of having at least 2 burns, and they're at different times of the year, therefore having different effect. You're going to do at least 2 burns during the contract period. Annual application by burning different patches each year. In one season, 1 year is acceptable for many wildlife species. And prescribed burning will be planned and applied in a manner that is not going to undo what we're trying to do with the burns, in a way that's compatible with the wildlife. Conduct treatments during times of the year that accommodate the reproduction cycles of the wildlife. You want a WEG score of 0.75 or greater after these practices. You want a written prescribed burn plan for each burn that meets or exceeds NRCS prescribed burning standard. And of course, the way we do that in Utah is we get the assistance of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands to do the burn practices and burn plans for us. We don't have any NRCS employees that have approval authority for prescribed burning in Utah. So you're either going to get the assistance from Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, or we're going to have to go out of state to bring someone in to help with planning these. Documentation requirements. You need that burn plan. You need a map. This is all pretty basic stuff. You need the WEG. Okay, so that's the prescribed burn practices that are applicable on rangeland, and these were both applicable on range or forest. Now there are other prescribed burning enhancements. There's these 3 right here that are applicable on forest land only, that I am going to spare you today from going into details on, because I have to do a whole other set of webinars for all the forestry practices on forest land, so I'm saving these for that. But just know that I've only told you about 2 of the 5 prescribed burning enhancements here today. And okay, last slide, I already covered this. We're going to get help from Forestry, Fire, and State Lands for prescribed burns. Any questions on these enhancements? Okay, we got through several enhancements today, and we're less than an hour, so yay, thank you for your participation. Any follow-up questions, feedback, what you want to see next, comments? Okay, I'm going to keep building these and having these calls until we've got through all the enhancements. Thanks for your participation.